Hello, welcome to Jazz Is.
Jazz Is
MasterClass series
at the National Jazz Museum at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.
I am Sekou McMillan, the curator of special projects.
My name is Albert Marquez, Zach O'Farrell.
My name is Shirazette Titten.
And we are in conversation with the legendary Bertha Hope. Jazz could only have happened here in America.
The key to everything was the radio.
So this world is too dense. 15 minutes isn't enough to cover it all.
Are you ready? I am.
Jazz could only have happened here in the United States, and we say post-colonial because we know that America existed long before we called it America. My name is Melanie George, and I am a jazz dance historian, educator, and curator. So we're going to start with part one, which is the formation of the tree, or what I call the roots and fruits. And then I'm going to do a little deconstruction about why sometimes that framework fails us a little bit. To start with, it's important to understand that the roots of jazz dance are African. Full stop, this is not negotiable, this is the history. We know this because jazz is America's post-colonial indigenous dance form. And what I mean by that is that jazz could only have happened here in the United States, and we say post-colonial because we know that America existed long before we called it America. We know that it's indigenous post-colonial dance form because jazz could only have happened here in America. It is the mixing of what happens by bringing enslaved people through the Middle Passage, coming to the United States, and what happens when there is a mixing of different cultures, but also the root, the basic root is always African. So what does that mean? That means we have certain elements that are in the blood memory of people's bodies that form the basis of jazz dance. And we see this in early jazz dance, we see it in mid-20th century jazz dance, we see it in hip hop, and we see it in the dancing that is done today. So no matter what anyone tells you, I'm here to tell you the roots of jazz dance are African, and I will die on that hill because that is the history. So some things I want you to know. We're going to start with what are those elements that I talked about in terms of the sort of blood memory, Afrokinetic memory that we see over time. And there are 14 elements, and I am going to challenge myself in this moment to try to name all 14 elements for you. We may have to stop along the way, but we're going to try this. So first and foremost, we know that jazz dance is polyrhythmic and syncopated. And this is something that really sets it apart from other dance forms that were being developed at the same time, or other dance forms that call themselves jazz, but there is no rhythm present. And so with the absence of rhythm, you cannot have jazz dance. You can have things that are jazz influenced, you can have things that are jazzy, as I like to call them, but in the absence of rhythm and syncopation, the question is always going to be, what makes it jazz? We also talk about movement as being very grounded, close to the earth. Another element would be the use of very bent limbs or joints and an inclined torso as well. So we're at 4 right now. We're going to keep going, and we're going to talk about jazz dance as something that always has improvisation as a base. And this is something that obviously it has in connection with jazz music, because the music and the dance were formed at the same time. And so if improvisation is the base of the music, it is also the base of the dancing. And this ties back to our African roots, where improvisation is very much a cultural value. Another important element that we have is what we call polycentrism. And so polycentrism is when different parts of the body are moving at the same time, as opposed to the body being one single unit, as we might see in, say, ballet, where the torso is moving as with the pelvis. In jazz dance, the pelvis might be doing one thing, while the arms are doing something else, while the head is doing something else. And we have this separation between the upper and lower parts of the body so that we see this multi-unit kind of moving. We also talk about the idea of isolations, that individual body parts are going to move separately. Now, I just talked about the idea of polycentrism, where we have multiple things moving at once, but also the singularity of the head being able to be on its own. And again, that's very different from the whole torso moving at the same time. The head might be doing something, the wrist might be doing something, the ankle might be doing something, but all of this is happening at once. And so the jazz body is a very multifarious, very complex way of moving. Another important value of jazz dance is this idea of the community and the individual being in dialogue with each other. And so what that means is I'm allowed to be myself, and me as an individual is making a very important contribution, but also I'm a part of a larger community, and this art form does not exist by itself with people behaving on their own, right? We're always in dialogue with other people. And so that means sometimes I'm doing a solo, sometimes I'm with the group. That means sometimes I'm the musician, that means sometimes I'm the dancer. That means sometimes I'm watching the dancing, or sometimes I'm in the dancing. All of this is part of a community-based art form, and it's because it's a dance form that really comes from the people. So when we use words like vernacular or authentic jazz, we're talking about community-based dancing. It is social dancing. It is of the people. We also talk about the use of a flat foot and bent limbs as being sort of fundamental to the way the body is being used in jazz dance. That sense of being close to the earth doesn't mean that we're not going to elevate sometimes, but we also know that that flat foot facilitates us being able to do footwork, which is another really core element of what you find in jazz dance and jazz-informed dancing. We also talk about improvisation as being key, critical to any jazz dance form. And so I really encourage you to ask yourself, if there's no improvisation in the dancing, is it really jazz? Because improvisation is a fundamental component of what even makes jazz jazz. We see it in the music, we absolutely see it in the dancing, because the dancing and the movement were created at the same time. The dancers were influencing the musicians were influencing the dancers, and that core value is that there's always a place for you to add something of yourself. One of my favorite quotes is by, I learned from a jazz historian named Robert O'Mealy, and he talks about jazz, about Duke Ellington, the great composer Duke Ellington, always leaving room for his co-signers, right? And so he was the grand architect, but there was always space for his musicians, the folks working with him, to contribute to the endeavor. And that's what we see in the dancing as well. You may get a piece of choreography, but there's always space for you to bring something of your own to it. And so that means improvisation. It also means embellishment or enhancing it. The idea that you get to make it your own and it's still jazz is fundamental. We also talk about an inclined torso. So as opposed to that sort of ramrod straight spine, you might bend forward a little bit because it's going to facilitate you getting closer to the earth and allow you to do a lot of movement that a straight back will not allow for. The last two elements I want to talk about is one, asymmetry. The idea that it's not about everything being balanced, but there's going to be some angularity in the movement. And this sometimes can confuse us because there are some forms that call themselves jazz and they're doing angles, but it's really just ballet with angles. And so that sense of asymmetry and angularity has to be playing with all of these other elements for it to still be jazz. Lastly, I want to name a term that was coined by an important scholar named Robert Ferris Thompson, and he termed it the aesthetic of the cool. The aesthetic of the cool is that juxtaposition of something being simultaneously complex while also looking effortless. And so that sense of cool, when also you see someone doing something with their body that seems quite impossible, that juxtaposition is something that we see in all forms of jazz dancing and jazz-influenced dancing. And so this aggregate, all of these many, many elements that I talked about are always present all of the time in the dancing. And it's what makes jazz, like the music, it's what makes jazz dancing this really highly complex form. So when you're looking at the roots and the fruits, and we're talking about what is early jazz or what is sometimes called authentic jazz, which Honestly, you should just be calling it jazz. It doesn't need a qualifier. It is jazz. We often are referring to dancing that is called Lindy hopping or solo jazz. So Lindy hopping is the partner dancing that you see from the early 30s and 40s. And solo jazz is when you see them dancing solo. And amongst those two dance forms is this massive vocabulary of steps that people are still doing today. There's a very robust Lindy hop and solo jazz scene that's quite global. And so these steps, this big bank of steps, this vocabulary forms the basis of what we know to be jazz dancing. And steps have been modified over time, but you can often trace them back to steps that were being done in the 20s, in the 30s, and in the 40s. And so I want to leave you in this last segment with four dancers, four performers, groups of performers that are emblematic of what we're calling authentic jazz, which is just jazz, or early jazz, or just the real true jazz. And so number one would be Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, which is this amazing group that encompassed roughly 40 plus dancers. But specifically, I want you to look for a performance from a film called Hell's a Poppin', which is a film from the 1940s. It has a very sort of wild script. One of the key performers in the acting portion of the film is one of the Three Stooges, Shemp Howard. But what this film is most noted for is that it has the greatest Lindy hopping scene of all time. This is the most iconic piece of Lindy hopping choreography, and it has four of the greatest Lindy hopping couples, which includes, but not limited to, Frankie Manning, who is one of our great kings of Lindy hopping. So in this film, Hell's a Poppin' is this scene that starts out with a band, and then it goes to dancers, and you see this amazing set of choreography that was created for this film. And we're so lucky that it was captured on film. We're so lucky that they were doing this kind of dancing at a time when film existed. It's so iconic, I've never seen anyone be able to reproduce it. And so look for Hell's a Poppin'. It is an iconic piece of choreography. Number two, I want you to look up an artist named Earl Snakehips Tucker. If Whitey's Lindy Hoppers are the sort of iconic archetype of what is great Lindy hopping, then Earl Snakehips Tucker, what we call the icon of eccentric dancing. He had this way of moving his body, of moving his hips and his spine that was called eccentric because it was in a way that it seemed like no one would be able to move their body in this way. No one would be able to move their hips in this way. And there's not a lot of film of him, but there is a really important clip that you can find online. And so I encourage you to look him up. And let it be said that everything that people were giving Elvis Presley credit for in the 1950s, Earl Snakehips Tucker was doing literal decades before. And he should be getting the credit for that way of moving. Number three, I want you to look up a dancer called Consuela Harris. She is known as one of the great shake dancers. Highly flexible, danced with this sense of wild abandon, was twerking before twerking ever existed. She has a kinetic sense of movement that makes her singular. When you see a Consuela Harris video, a performance on film, you know exactly who it is because no one else looked like her dancing. And lastly, I'm going to throw out a name that I'm sure you know, but it bears repeating. Look up the Nicholas Brothers, iconic team of tap dancers who were simultaneously a class act and a flash act. They could do the amazing tricks, but also did it in this very classy way with their tuxedos and their suits, the best of the best, and they have some of the great dance duo performances ever recorded on film. So in conclusion, I want you to think about how all of these elements show up or do not show up in the dancing that you're going to be watching. And so the elements are very clearly in those artists that I named, those African roots, and how all of that comes into this clearly American indigenous form. And then also as we go into part two, we're going to talk about how they don't always show up and how some of that stuff is not jazz.